This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Amanda Boston, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on Black studies approaches to urban studies, questions of neoliberalism and economics, and the impact of structural racism on housing in historically Black communities. She's completing her first book on gentrification's racial operations and the making and unmaking of Black communities in her hometown of Brooklyn, New York, and she has published related works in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes in sociology and urban history. In this conversation, we discuss multidisciplinary approaches to the study of Black urban life, the relationship between social scientific methodologies and traditions of Black studies, and the impact of Black studies research on Black communities and struggles for racial justice. Good afternoon, Amanda. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Really happy that you made time for the Black Studies podcast today. We're recording this at the end of everybody's semester, and I know you said you just relocated for the summer, so squeezing in this. I appreciate you taking the time for that. We're slowly documenting Black studies at University of Pittsburgh, it appears, so I'm really happy to have your contribution. I think the research you do is super interesting, and so I'm really excited to hear your perspective on the field of Black studies, your relationship to it in terms of your research. But as a last thing, also, you're someone who has been Africana Studies from the beginning of your education. And I think that's just like this extra special thing. I know you have your PhD in the field, and we have a number of people with that, but you are sort of from college birth to your workplace. And so it's really important to have this kind of perspective in the podcast. That's all a long way of saying welcome to the Black Studies podcast, and I appreciate you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, we'll have a chance to talk about how you imagine the field of Black studies and your research and how you think about your research in relation to it. But I wanted to start with this really more personal question and to ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what keeps you connected to and sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Sure. So, I have to say that my time as an undergraduate at Duke University represents my first formal foray into Black studies. But as you know, the field is also deeply rooted in the political culture of the Black community, right? So even the work that I do today, which is on race and gentrification in Brooklyn, focusing on Brooklyn's Black communities, that work is shaped by experiences that predate my formal education, right? Being raised by parents with deep roots in the rural South who migrated to New York City in the 50s and 60s, who are intentional about retaining and passing down Black Southern culture and family history, being exposed to Black history, not shying away from challenges that Black Americans were still facing, right? And also making sure that I was in community with other Black people and participating in opportunities and activities that helped me develop a positive racial identity, right? And a sense of belonging and a healthy self-concept. So all of that cultural, political, educational scaffolding was bolstered by my upbringing in Brooklyn, right? One of the largest contiguous Black communities in the U.S. with its deep history of Black nationalist culture and politics. And Brooklyn's also one of the most ethnically diverse Black communities in the nation, right? It's home to one of the most ethnically diverse. And so that gave me an appreciation of the sort of breadth and depth of Black joy and struggle, as well as its global dimension. So, my research focuses on my hometown. So that origin story is especially meaningful. So once I got to Duke, a friend who had gone to my high school had recommended that I take Intro to African and African American Studies. That's what the discipline is at Duke. So my very first class, 8:30 a.m. on a Monday morning, was with Mark Anthony Neal.
8:30 a.m. on a Monday?
That's when I used to be able to, that's when I used to be alert at that hour.
Yeah. Mark was an early guest on the podcast and a good friend of mine. I didn't know he was that hardcore, 8:30 a.m. Okay, extra respect for Mark.
Well, he's probably trying to get rid of us early in the day, get him in and out. But no, I love him dearly. So very first class was with Mark Anthony Neal, his TA Treva Lindsay, who is now a full professor at Ohio State, right? And it just really unlocked something in me not just exposing me to hidden histories, but just giving me these broader frameworks to put everything that I kind of took for granted, putting it all into context and giving me these frameworks to think critically about the world, right? And these skills to process and navigate the world. So a few semesters later, Kerry Haney, he's a political scientist at Duke. His courses are on race and American political system will spark that same curiosity. And so I had two majors, studying race in these different ways. And then I think one major event was the election of Barack Obama as president when I was an undergrad. And so I started to have all these questions about how at some level there appeared to be all success and expanded possibility for some Black people, while so many more were struggling with marginalization on so many fronts, right? Continued segregation, educational inequality, political disenfranchisement, police brutality, right? And so those questions started to take shape in both of my majors and projects that I was conducting. So in poli-sci, I was looking at this transition from sort of the old guard of race men and women who are Black politicians to this sort of, post-racial or quote unquote deracialized Black politics, and this idea that Black political presence isn't the same as Black political power. And then I was also taking, my senior seminar with Micheline Critchlow at Duke. And we took a class, it was a class called Citizens and Subjects, Race, Place, and Power. And these readings and films on the marketization of citizenship in Haiti and in post-Katrina New Orleans actually led me to think more deeply about gentrification. And at that point, there wasn't very much work on gentrification in Black Brooklyn. There still isn't enough, right? But I was thinking about Harlem because that's where the scholarship took me. And then I, continued my graduate studies in political science at Duke, tabled that gentrification research till I got to Brown. And then a couple of weeks into my first semester at Brown, the Barclays Center opened. The Brooklyn Nets Arena, about 15 minutes away from my childhood home in Clinton Hill, sort of northwestern Brooklyn. And I'm watching Jay-Z's opening concert on YouTube on his New Life and Times series, because, he's going to get his brand in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I just remember watching this big concert on YouTube in this little Rhode Island apartment, like, okay, this is more than just some weird project in my backyard, right? Somebody's got to write about this. So tinkered with different topics, took classes with some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, Trisha Rose, Matthew Pratt-Gatturo, Tony Bowles, right? An interdisciplinary committee. And I really came to understand Brooklyn as a site where all the questions about culture, politics, belonging, race, place representation, justice, right? Really all the questions I had been interested in came to life. And so that's how I came to seriously research race and gentrification in my hometown, specifically through the lens of the experiences of Black Brooklynites.
So I wanted to follow up just quickly and go back to the sort of, I don't know what you would call it, but it's like the piece that you didn't talk about. You talked about I love this idea that the Black studies having roots not only in like sort of family conversations and sense of identity and meaning, but also the diversity, the ethnic diversity of Brooklyn. And then arriving at that 8:30 a.m. on a Monday. There's something about it on a Monday. Please tell me it was not a Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Absolutely, it was.
It was?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. I mean,
yeah, maybe it was Monday, Wednesday. It was about 20 years ago. Maybe it was Monday, Wednesday, but it was early, and it was,
I'm just having very terrible memories of my own early teaching career early in the morning. But it's sort of that move from the sort of family community to this intro class, your first year in college. And I'm curious how that sort of arrival to the study of Black life, to Black studies in that semester, how that related to your K through 12 education. Was it one of these moments where it was like, oh, these things that were a part of my home and community life sort of have a study dimension? Or was your K through 12 education also somewhat connected to or looped into what we might think of as a kind of proto-Black studies sensibility?
That's a great question. I would say even before my K-12 education, right, I went to a nursery school in Prospect Lefferts Gardens that was operated by an Afro-Panamanian woman who had us singing Whitney Houston's Star Spangled Banner in the morning, right? Watching Celia Cruz and, so very sort of diasporic upbringing, not super political, but just exposure to Black culture globally and pride in it, right? And meeting, folks, particularly other kids from the West Indies, or rather, for the children of immigrants from the West Indies, right? So very global exposure early on. K to 12 was not so deeply, there wasn't such deep immersion in Black culture in my formal education. I went to public school until seventh grade. And then at seventh grade, I went to private school. And there wasn't a huge emphasis on sort of African American history,
Mm.
right? I was able to take a excellent, I had excellent teachers, but, I think it was a standard U.S. history curriculum where you kind of skip from emancipation to Martin Luther King,
Sure.
right? And so the sort of education I received at home, uh, the, even down to the murals, right? I have these distinct memories of murals of Marcus Garvey and Harriet Tubman, in the places where, my family would maybe go to the barber shop or go get groceries or this and that, right? So I think the most important education happened outside of the classroom for sure. So much so that by the time I got to college, I already had a sense. I knew that Black life was worthy of serious examination,
Mm,
right? That
mhm.
that there was a history that still needed to be uncovered that was worth exploring. So there was no resistance when the idea came that I should take that class with Professor Nitt, right? Even if
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was at 8:30 in the morning.
I love that. No, I appreciate that response. I mean, these personal narratives of, how people come to work in Black studies, or how people come to study Black life, some of the most interesting parts of the podcast series for me, and I think for a lot of listeners. And it's interesting what what a wide range of roles a K through 12 education can play, right? That sometimes it's all this proto work that sort of gets you along the way. There's also this often this sense of contrast of, like, let me find a place where I can take seriously this thing I want to take seriously. Um,
Right.
so I appreciate you that reflection on that. And this next question I have for you is such an important one for someone like you, who's you know uh, first semester college through PhD through your current employer, uh, Africana Studies, and I'm interested in how you imagine the field. What's that portrait of Black studies for you? And I always like to ask this question in the context of its origin, which has a real tension built into it. And that tension is really so much about how initially students had this insistence on a place on campus to study Black life. That there was this, the traditional disciplines had not found a way to study Black intellectual traditions, Black history, Black literature, and so forth, right? And we inherit that today in a commitment of Black studies to the intellectual tradition. But this is also happening at a time when the radicalization of Black liberation struggle has really tried to blur those and really contested those boundaries between, books and ideas and mobilization and prescriptive action between campuses and classrooms and communities and activist space. And so I think we also inherit that in terms of the field of Black studies commitment to a certain kind of liberatory politics. And that tension between a political commitment and an intellectual commitment for me, is really interesting origin story that I think we live with today. And sort of in that long sort of introduction to the question, I'm interested to hear you talk about how you imagine the field sort of couched in or framed by this originary dispute.
Yeah, I think that Black studies in many ways is designed to be in the university, but not of the university, right? And so the idea that institutionalizing Black studies is not supposed to neutralize its potential.
Mm,
And so, with that said, I imagine the field of Black studies as being multidimensional, right? It's an academic discipline. It's an intellectual tradition that is not bound by the university. It's a social movement, right? Its foundations are in the lived experiences and knowledge of Black people, the foundational work of sort of late 19th, early 20th century Black scholars, but also, again, these contributions of Black communities working outside of the academy. And
mm,
so I would say the field is, and a lot of your other guests have talked about in these terms, right? It's an emancipatory project. It's
mhm,
grounded in critique of master narratives, right? Critique of ideas about the world that normalize Eurocentric frameworks, that normalize white supremacy, and racial inequality, narratives that relegate Black life and experience to the margins, right? But it doesn't stop there, right? That's the creative part. It creates these counter narratives based on histories, politics, and cultures of Black people across the world for the purpose of creating a better world. And
Mhm.
so, those master narratives are still powerful. So I think that if Black studies is doing what it's supposed to do, which involves developing a sort of intellectual expressive tradition, right, that's rooted in all those forms of knowledge that I just mentioned, right, it will have some political impact. And that might be raising the consciousness of young people, preparing them to be change agents, propelling racial equity work within universities, producing scholarship that impacts policy. But, that's frankly why it's been under attack for so long, and
Yeah.
especially over the past few years. So, yeah.
Yeah, I always think, and I've mentioned this in a number of episodes. I think back to this question when my collaborator Ashley and I were coming up with guiding questions for the series, and it was in early 2024, and very much this idea that tension was palpable. It's really interesting to ask that question in at this point late May 2026, where the tension doesn't seem to be palpable. It actually, what's palpable is the lack of tension, the sheer
Mm.
practice of reading and discussing Black texts, Black intellectual traditions, so deeply political. With the real bite. I mean, people lose jobs, to put it that way.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And that's not to say, and I do have some critiques and some, suggestions for improvement, right? So
Of
there is
course,
some tension, but again, I think you said it perfectly in that this current political moment really highlights the radical potential of Black studies and why I think it might be time to get back to the roots in some ways.
yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Well, let me shift a little bit and ask about your work. You've sort of alluded to or sort of named some things around urban studies, gentrification, structural racism, housing economics, and also cultural studies. And this cluster of interests produces so many insights for Black studies. Really in so many ways, exactly what you were just talking about, thinking about the political impact of the kind of work that we do. I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about your research and how you think it fits in the history of the field, like how it fits in the tradition of Black studies, but also what boundaries you think it pushes or what horizons you think it opens up.
Sure. So it's funny you say that. I really do cover a lot of ground in my work. So part of that is because I'm a Brooklyn supremacist. So I think that the entire world, its ills and its cures can be found in Brooklyn, right? But also during my first year at Brown, Trisha Rose had me read Horace Cayton and St. Clair Drake's Black Metropolis, and
Mm,
seeing this gorgeous, sweeping account of not just of the structural constraints facing Black folks. Of course, they're writing about Chicago, but these vibrant and complex lives and institutions that they built really inspires me to look at this one site, right, Black Brooklyn, from different disciplinary and thematic perspectives, right? So yes, I can give you a chapter on hip hop as a Trojan horse for gentrification. I can do ethnographic research with a local arts nonprofit and analyze how sort of grassroots artistic practice can show us a way forward in times of crisis. And I can turn around and publish, an article on the manipulation of the EB-5 visa program and the construction of a gilded metropolis on the backs of Black communities. And it all makes perfect sense to me because the terrain Black communities are navigating in this moment is complex. And so are the questions of
mhm,
freedom
mhm.
and equality that animate my work. Um, and so, beyond being inspired by texts like Black Metropolis, right? I think the sort of multifaceted approaches I take to questions about Black life in the city really stem from the interdisciplinary nature of Africana studies. So some might mischaracterize Black studies as limiting, but I've understood it in some regards as limitless, right? I can bridge insights from diverse methods and fields and find new approaches to address sort of complex issues and problems, right? And that includes gentrification and its human toll.
So that's maybe already a partial answer to this question that I have about how the fact that you've worked from your BA, MA, and PhD, as well as your your position in a Department of Africana Studies, that you've worked in Black studies across your intellectual career as a student and professor. And I'm interested, I know you also mentioned you have a BA in political science, but for the most part, you've moved outside of conventional or traditional disciplines. And so I'm interested to
Yeah.
hear you talk a little bit more about how you think the fact that you've never really passed through a discipline in your formal training has shaped how you imagine, conceive, and do research projects. But also for me, the kind of way that this education outside of a discipline shapes how you conceive and practice a classroom.
Sure. So my training in Black studies is absolutely informative, right, to the development of my research. So, for example, one of my intellectual communities is just straight up urban history, right? But I arrived at urban history by way of Africana studies, right? So that means I was reading traditional urban history texts, right? These books on cities and sites of trade, commerce, productivity, all that good stuff, alongside these interdisciplinary studies of race, structural racism, place annihilation, and Black community formation. So that helped me to basically contextualize these struggles over cities, capital, and urban space in really expansive ways, right? So I could look at an incredible text on gentrification, and one I constantly go to is Neil Smith's The New Urban Frontier, right? And so he has these theories of the new urban frontier, of uneven development and revanchism that are super helpful to me. But I can take that and I can say yes and right. And
Mm-hmm.
so Smith gives me these powerful frameworks to work with uh, in terms of this new urban frontier, right? The city that's primed for gentrification as a resolutely economic creation, he always says. But then what Du Bois says in the Philadelphia Negro, right? What Caton and Drake say in Black Metropolis, what other scholars of Black urban life have shown, right? What I've lived through also,
Hmm.
is that, we can't understand who lives in our cities, where they live, how they got there, how they can or can't stay put, without reckoning with the ways racial hierarchies remain central to the sort of top-down organization of the built environment and of urban life, right? So placing Black life and community at the center of my inquiry allows me to sort of disrupt and expand narratives that fail to account for the full range of human experience, or even shed light on how power structures that have gone or inadequately interrogated affect us all.
Hmm. How do you think that, this is a thing that both Ashley and I find also really interesting is the Black Studies classroom and how it has unique features or particular features that traditional disciplines don't. And I'm also interested then in how, not having passed through, say, a political science department for your PhD and then coming to an Africana Studies department, how you imagine and practice classrooms, how you conceive classrooms.
I would say the majority of the students I encounter are non-majors passing through my classrooms currently. And so I'm constantly drawing across disciplines sort of to make things legible
Hmm.
to them, but also because that's just the way I learn, right? My mentors, my professors never shied away from saying, okay, we could use this to help us understand a particular experience in, Aphrodite's work existence.
Hmm.
But we can also critique, right? So I'm drawing from, political theorists, but also drawing from, people who are strictly Black studies, people who are focused on, sort of women's and gender studies. I'm drawing from journalists, right? And so I've just kind of learned that the world is your oyster again because Black experience is so multifaceted that it demands different sources, right? Engagement and influencing different sources. Uh, and I think also, I would say one thing I do in the classroom is again I try to get folks back down to the root of the discipline. So one thing I constantly will do every semester that I teach intro, I bring in people who are involved in the founding of our department.
Mm, uh-huh.
People who help. We have a incredible guy, Dr. Curtis Porter, who he basically helped orchestrate a sit-in in the Pitt Computer Center that got some major concessions and created what became the department. So having him reflect on, what it meant to create that into curriculum, what it meant to stand up for something during a difficult time, to lay things down on the line, to get people to buy into this protest, right? I think that also helps to get students not just sort of in the theoretical issues that concern Black folks around the world over time, but also to ground them in what's going on at, right, in my case at Pitt, but right in the very context in which they're living that
Hmm.
is still shaping, right, what they're going through uh, currently.
Yeah, I think about back to, and I always like to intro podcast references when they uh, come up naturally. Uh, about a year ago, an episode with Abdullah Kalimat, and one of the things he had said in that I thought was so interesting and so important. I mean, I brought it to my own department. He said, he had this sort of set of prescriptions like every department should, and it was every department should have a history of itself. And it really stuck with me. And when you said that about being able to bring somebody into the classroom who's able to tell the origin story and the history, um, I just think that's really powerful. I mean, it's one thing to say, look, this is a department that was birthed out of a certain kind of struggle by students like you. It's a whole different thing to bring somebody into the classroom. It's like, this is
Right.
what it was, and to have some presence of that history. So I love that. We need that here very badly at University of Maryland. I think it's one of our projects to find a way to have that because I can imagine it has
Right.
a real effect on students.
It does. It does. I mean, first of all, we are relatively young disciplines. So we have the privilege of having people who are living still,
Exactly.
who are engaged in those founding conversations, right? And actions. So, and many of them still live close to the community. So it kind of makes sense. And actually, I modeled that practice after Professor Francoise Hamlin, also at Brown. I TA'd for her intro class, and she does a lot of great work, particularly around the Southern freedom struggle. But I remember her bringing in, folks who were involved in those initial protests at Brown to bring more Black students in, to get more Black faculty and that sort of thing, and to see them, to know that these are not, some distant folks who we just kind of put on a shelf and say they were great, they did that. But these are people who have things that they can teach us right now. And Brown students love a protest. Uh,
Yeah.
and we're just in a climate where there's so many important student movements taking place, and so I think they do find inspiration in seeing folks who are successful
Hmm.
in their actions.
Yeah, I mean, just one last thing on that. I mean, I think about I had a podcast episode with Javette Ward, who's the chair of Black
Yeah.
Studies at City College, and
Yes.
and then she came down with the filmmaker as well as one of the original activists to screen their was it the Five Demands, or I think it's Five Demands, a film which is documentary on the founding of Black Studies at City College. And I thought
Yes.
Javette and the filmmaker, whose name is escaping me right now, they were fantastic. And then there was he's a now retired professor, but was one of the student activists. And there were tons of students there, and they just couldn't stop talking about every single word he said. They were like, you know, this reminds us that we're walking in and out of this department, in and out of these classes because of this kind of courage. And, they're like, I have a hard time asking for an extension, much less demanding that, the president of the university, change the structure of the university, and we're going to sit in his office until it changes. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I love that. Also wanted to get to this, thinking about research, but also classrooms. There were two things you said. I also just wanted to underscore when you were talking about your own research, and you said, sort of walking through an urban studies text and for your own research. And then at the conclusion of that, you say, I think your phrase was yes, and that additive dimension, that composite dimension of the Black Studies research moment. And then also when you were talking about teaching, you said something very similar to that. And the thing that you said similar to that ended with demands, right? That it demands this kind of research, demands this kind of curiosity. And I love that sort
Yeah.
of moral imperative blended with the additive dimension of Black Studies research. I think you really captured like the sort of moral consciousness of the field, but also the way it requires a lot more reading.
Absolutely. And look, some of it isn't a yes and some of it is like that's dead wrong. So let me show you how to do it, right?
That too.
But there's a lot of great stuff, right? And it's just like, okay. that's good. But let me take this a step further and tell you what's happening over here and how that affects all y'all over there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have two more questions for you. The first one is thinking about the history of the field of Black studies and its future. What do you think Black studies has done well historically? But also, what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Sure. I think that Africana Studies has done a great, or Black Studies, right, in all of its forms, has done a really great job of keeping questions of emancipation at the forefront of its scholarship. I remember one of the amazing things about my PhD program was just being with these young scholars, just who are all just investigating all these different aspects of Black life across the world, right? And all of these, just how freedom manifests through not just, gentrification and sort of urban space, but performance, from religion, um, literature, right? All this just this incredible research, right? And so there are going to be these ideological disagreements and so forth. It's inevitable, right? Just as in any discipline, but that concern with freedom and justice is still central. And I think that's one of the things that keeps me going. Um, did you ask me what it hasn't done well, or
Yeah.
just the
What
good
has it not
stuff?
done particularly well? I mean, I like that
Sure.
characterization of what it's done well. I think that's really beautifully put. It's like whatever the disputes, which, disputes can be painful, but they're also part of what it
Mhm.
means to be inside of a tradition. Um,
Yeah,
but but they're also, no, it's every field is in motion. So what has it not done particularly well?
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think one thing I'd like us to return to as a field is more direct engagement with local communities that gave a lot of Africana Studies departments their start, right? So, for example, in the case of Pitt, it's like, yes, they were enrolled students who were agitating, but they were also, dealing with folks in the Hill District, right? Folks who may not have had access to the university, but who are still deeply invested in sort of Black life and these major questions. So,
Uh-huh.
and that's not to say, again, it's not to say that scholarship in Black studies today isn't concerned with problems and issues facing Black folks, or that all departments have this issue. Actually, I think sort of some of the demands of professionalization, chronic underfunding, faculty shortages, and so on and so forth have led a lot of departments to focus really on their own survival and
Yeah.
stature within their universities, and to pull back from community engaged work that edifies people beyond the university. But I think, again, we keep talking about this political moment, and I'm just thinking about book bans, curriculum restrictions, and just a widespread attack on Black and marginalized histories and people straight up, right? And not to mention sort of the charlatans just spreading false narratives on social media, right? So I think Black studies programs and departments, scholars and students all have a lot to offer the public, not just in terms of subject matter education, right? A Black History Month speech here or there, but just like slow and steady work of supporting critical thinking, political education, and civic leadership. So I'd love to see and hear about more about Black studies programs strengthening their ties to communities near campus, offering freedom schools, bringing people on and off campus together for critical thinking and collective action.
Thank you for that. No, I love that. Not only the invocation of like community and connection to community, but the way you laid it out there as in its variety of ways. And I also been thinking a lot lately, and this has come up in a number of episodes where we're in this moment where the existence of Black Studies departments is in real question at so many places, and the one of the things that comes up, one of the things that comes into focus in times of crisis is who are our allies.
Mhm.
Is it going to be a history department? Is it going to be an English department? I mean, those departments really are not allies. They're not going to walk off the job if um, if we're closed down. But it also is that moment to say, what have we done with community, whether it's campus community with students, right? But also community in the broader sense that you're talking about. Like, what does it mean if we don't feel like those are our allies? Whereas the
Yeah.
original, as you said, the origin was those were not only the allies, but those were the motivating energies. And so I think the question about survival has to be really connected to that. And I appreciate you putting it so clearly there.
Yeah, I think it goes back. I think earlier I talked about being in but not of the university.
Yeah.
And that in times like this is kind of like a life raft. It's
Oh,
like
absolutely.
we recognize that the university didn't give birth to Black studies, and so the university can't take it away.
Yeah.
So what knowing that, right, in this again, in this political moment, right? How do we navigate this terrain knowing that our purpose lies beyond, whether a particular political administration or university administration is invested in supporting our mission?
Well, you've already, I think, spoken to this, but I'll ask it anyway. As a final question, what is the question, thinking in a Black Studies context, what is the question you would want us to all be asking or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
Sure. I think I am going to build on my answer to the previous question. I think Black Studies scholars are going to have to ask ourselves whether our scholarship is getting to the people who need it most. So, not just political education, like I talked about before, being accessible to the public, in communities near campus, but also the digital humanities. So, there's a real thirst for knowledge and a desire for understanding, not just of our current moment, but how we got here, how we could find our way out. And I think a lot of folks, including our students, want information that's at their fingertips,
Yeah.
right? They don't always want to read the books, and it's getting worse. The TikTokification of attention spans is really
Oh,
out
it's
of
brutal.
control. And
It's
so,
brutal.
okay. And so you've got, sometimes they're finding incorrect and misleading information. And so what does that mean for us not to sacrifice scholarly rigor in any way, but to meet people where they are, right? To record the podcast like you all are brilliantly doing, right? To make the YouTube series, to co-host a lecture series with local churches and community members, right? So how can we be as intentional about, reaching these professional milestones that are necessary to sustain, that the institutionalized field of Africana studies, but also bringing our work directly to the people.
What a fantastic place to wrap up. I love that. I think that there's a clarity of your articulation of it there that is so important and really moves so far beyond sort of tropes about community connection, but really putting real vocabulary to it, real content to it, and real like politics and ethics. So what a great place to wrap up. And this has been a fantastic conversation, Amanda. I really appreciate you making the time, but your thoughtfulness and insight just makes this episode such a great contribution to the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your afternoon.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.